Well, welcome to another episode of the Residential Developer Podcast. I'm the host. My name is Nathan Battishall. And this week I want to talk about the 7-star rating, thermal rating in New South Wales. So the NCC 2022 introduced a new 7-star rating. Now this has been in effect for a while now, but we've seen in the development space a lot of developers, investors, design companies, building companies coming unstuck, really getting an understanding of this regulation that came in. Now, I've got a guest coming in later this year who is a thermal assessor. We're going to be breaking this down. So I want to use this episode as an introduction topic because I know this is an issue for a lot of investors and developers out there. It's a challenge that we've been personally facing, and I feel like we've become one of the leaders in this space when it comes to residential investments and developments in really looking through the lens of this code. So just to give you an idea, the NCC, so the National Construction Code, so they introduced a minimum 7-star rating. So in New South Wales, prior to that, we had our BASIX rating, and then often you could just do a BASIX. You wouldn't have to do what's called a NATHERS or a certificate, which is the thermal assessment of your building to determine the thermal comfort of your property. Obviously, one of the big things these days is trying to make properties more thermally efficient, to make houses more solar passive, and which I think is a good thing. It's only going to become more and more regulated as we push ahead into the future. I think 7-star is just a start, and that's not to scare people, but I think it's the base, it's the starting point, and I think it'll only go up from there. But what we saw when this regulation changed, we saw a lot of properties beginning to struggle to achieve that 7-star rating. Okay, now when it says 7-star, that's the efficiency of that property. So what we found, often this was the old school mentality that someone's got a block of land, they get a project home company, just pick a house and then just throw that house on the block, and generally had very little issue when it came to the thermal and energy efficiency side of the house. Even if the property was orientated poorly, it was very thermally inefficient, we were finding that it was quite easy to jump through those hoops and jump through those hurdles in order to get those properties passed. Now, so when the NCC updated this 7-star, we found a lot of houses were not hitting the mark. So no longer was it really viable or possible to put large houses with huge amounts of glazing to the south, for example, on these sites. You had to really find properties. If you're looking at a project home, for example, you had to find a design that was very much suited and sited and orientated to the site. In our case, I've always worked in that space of custom design, custom architectural design, building design. So it probably hadn't affected us as much as it would, say, a project type builder, because for them it's very difficult. They've got to try and have something in their range that will orientate and suit that site. Whereas the beauty is when you're custom designing something, you're able to look at the orientation, the efficiency, you're able to look at all the factors that will make a thermally efficient property on that site from the very get-go. So I think that's been very key. So the reality is now you don't have a choice. You have to prove that you can meet that 7-star rating. So whether it's a DA or it's a CDC or it's a CC, you have to have that document by a thermal assessor that shows that you've achieved that 7-star rating. There's actually no way to get a property through without it. Now, you may be able to somehow fudge it and have a certifier somehow sign off on it. You're running a risk. I don't know a single thermal assessor that would jeopardise their licensing and their qualification to do that. So the reality is you have to begin to start to think smartly and see from development point of view, what that does mean now, and I've said that to clients, where I look at development sites day in, day out, assessing sites for the potential of what can and can't be done on the site. Okay, and for me, when I look at that site, we now need to look through the lens of will we be able to get properties that will be able to achieve a 7-star rating on that site. So just because a site, you run a yield assessment on that site and it brings up that you can fit 7 townhouses, doesn't mean that you'll get 7 townhouses on that site. First and foremost, you need to comply with council's solar requirements of can you achieve that particular solar requirement for that council. In a lot of cases, it's 100%. Often the big number we see a lot of is you need 70% of those townhouses, for example, to achieve 3 hours of continuous sunlight in winter to both the living area and the private open space. Now, there's certain sites that just are not oriented appropriately to be able to get that yield. So 7 might become 4 or 5 or whatever the number may be. So when you're running a yield, the yield means nothing if you can't get it to comply. But not only that, you might be able to get 7 properties on that site, but you need to then look at how you're orientating those properties and how you're actually going to achieve that 7-star rating. So, look, for me, a lot of people are coming unstuck because obviously, there's a lot of factors that really help increase the ability to achieve that 7-star rating. And look, I think a lot of people get scared or they get freaked out about they overcomplicate something that is just simple, clear design principles that have been in from for a long, long time, that have even designers and architects dating back over 100 years have implemented a lot of these principles, understanding to use the natural elements of our world to heat and cool the property, to take advantage of the winter sun, to heat a house naturally in winter, and then to be able to ensure that a house isn't overheated in summer by by the use of glazing and shading and all of that sort of thing. And so, like, for me, first and foremost, the biggest mistake a lot of people make is the orientation of a property. Okay, so for me, obviously, the dream outcome in New South Wales, the dream outcome is to have a living area that faces north. Now that's commonly known, but I'm amazed at the amount of people that still don't understand it. Now, look, I get it. We do developments all the time where you're looking directly south to the ocean. Now, are you going to put all your living areas to the north? 100% no. You're going to orientate them to the south. But obviously you need to understand that that property is going to really struggle from a thermal assessment side of things if you have a whole lot of glass facing south, because what's going to happen is in winter, you're going to get no sun penetrating into those key parts of the house, the living areas, so it's going to feel extremely cold from a thermal comfort and a living point of view. But you also need to understand that when you do heat that house, and obviously because all of your living areas and all of your glazing is facing south, what's happening is that you're then having to heat that house with alternate methods. So in most people's case, it's having a reverse cycle heating system or a gas heating system or whatever type of heating system you've got. But then what's happening is a lot of the time you'll lose your heat through your glass and most importantly through your framing. You'll lose it through the walls. You'll lose it through the ceiling. So what's happening is if you don't have appropriately glazed windows, you don't have appropriate framing on your windows, if you don't have appropriate insulation in your walls and your ceiling, you can lose a lot of that heat, and then all of a sudden it's not a well-performing house. So essentially what the NCC outlined is they wanted to see houses performing in a more efficient manner okay, which I think is a good thing because we want to see houses that perform better and utilise the natural elements that we live in, like the sun, to be able to heat a house, and then to use natural elements of the house to ensure that it stays cool in summer, in the hot summer months in Australia. So, like for me, orientation is critical. It's important to orientate the house effectively. So ideally, you want to have your living areas facing north, okay? If they can't face north, the next best option is to try and get them to face east. So you can get quite a bit of sun in winter, but then ensuring that you've got protection, okay? On your western side of your property, obviously, is where you get that afternoon sun. Now, anyone who's got living areas or rooms that face west, you'll know if you've got quite a bit of glass on that western side, it's a scorching part of a house in the middle of summer. It can get very hot. So it's important to have protection. Now, when I say protection, that can either be no windows, or it can be, if you are going to have windows, you want to have appropriate overhangs, whether that be verandas, shading devices. There's all different methods of what you can do to protect that western side so that you're not getting the direct penetration of the sun. And by creating eaves or large overhangs or verandas, you're able to have those overhangs to be able to obviously shade that area to provide to avoid the direct penetration of the sun into those parts of the house that in summer will then ensure that house, that it's too warm in summer, and then you're going to have to use alternate cooling methods to cool that house down. So, you need to factor in things like that. Then you've got the south, which I spoke about before. Like that's a cold part of the house. So, there's just certain principles of trying to avoid. I try. Where possible, I like to avoid too many wet areas on the south, because where you've got your windows, then you've got a lot of condensation because it's cold. You get minimal access to the sun, especially if the south is down the side of a property. You've already got a house next door, so you're getting very little natural sunlight into that property. It can be cold, it can be dark, it can be dingy, it can be where you get a build-up of moisture, and it can be quite a cold space. So you want to try and avoid too much glass on the south, and you want to avoid things like overhangs, things like verandas, large eaves, because you're already not getting a lot of sun. So that's why you'll find you can get away without having to have large shading devices often on the south, because the reality is you don't get sun in those areas. So there's just key principles to think of when designing. And that's where a lot of people, if they want huge amounts of glazing, and I get it, where you've got views involved, it's key, it's critical. But I think where there's no views involved, it's key and important to really factor in how much glazing do you want? What type of glazing are you prepared to have? I think gone are the days now often where you can just go single glazing throughout, single clear glazing with standard aluminium frames. The reality is now you'll find that there's an importance and a need now to, in certain areas, to have at a bare minimum, low E glazing, or you even find some areas you need to have double glazing. And that's where it's key and critical to play around with it and have good design companies that have good thermal consultants, so that you can really study and look at how can you reduce that, some of the glazing, because certain areas you can't justify, $100,000 or $80,000 or $50,000 even in some areas in glass. So you need to be creative then of looking at, okay, how can we bring this down? How can we reduce this down so we can achieve the 7-star rating, but we're not paying overs for glass? It's going to ensure that this development's not profitable. That's where you've got to reverse engineer everything back, and I always talk about that, is looking at, okay, how do we strip the emotion away and make sure that we come up with a product that is achievable, is affordable, and is workable? Often you'll see there that, because the house hasn't been orientated well, it's been overglazed, it's not performing from a thermal comfort point of view, and all of a sudden you'll see that a thermal assessor then will put an unrealistic amount of insulation in a property. Like I've seen it before where some thermal assessors will put they'll put a certain amount of insulation in a wall that just can't fit in a 90 mil cavity. And if someone's not switched on or on top of or aware of what you can actually fit within that space, you're then getting an approval that's all well and good to get the 7-star approval, but you've got a product that can't be done. Or you see sometimes people have to put such a huge level of insulation in the floor or under the slab, and there's all these unnecessary things that are required. Like I said, huge amounts of double glazing that all of a sudden bump the project up to make it unfeasible. Whereas you want to be working with someone from the very start who understands how thermal comfort works in a house. Generally, you want to work with good design companies who understand solar passive thermal aspects of a property to get the right outcomes so that you can achieve the approval. It's thermally comfortable. It's designed in an efficient way, and it's oriented. Everything about the design has factored in those principles, but also so that it stacks up financially. And that's where I'm finding sometimes it's not working for a lot of people because they're getting emotionally invested. They're making decisions on certain things that have no outcome. For example, it's all well and good to have all this huge amount of glazing, but if you're just looking into a backyard and there's no views, there's no outlook and that sort of thing, but all of a sudden that is causing an issue and a problem then to have to go to a glazing level that's over capitalising that project. Well, you need to strip away some emotion and you need to make some tough decisions. Do you need to reduce some of that glazing? And often you'll find it's having no impact and no benefit on the profitability of that site. If there's views, it's a different story. You've got to make decisions then. You need to spend a bit more money on glazing. You need to possibly reduce glazing in some other areas, or you need to increase some insulation, or you've got to look at some alternate methods. And that's where getting a good thermal assessor who understands what you're doing and is willing to work with you is critical and is key. And I always say, try and find a thermal assessor. If in this case, anyone who's listening, you're passionate about doing developments and projects. So you want to work with a thermal assessor who understands development, who understands that, hey, this is the type of project I'm doing. These are the non-negotiables. These are the areas I'm happy to spend a little bit more money on this, on this, on this. These are the areas I'd have to be careful of. So you let them know from the start that, hey, this particular project, I can justify double glazing because it's on the ocean or it's a high spec'd up area. Or if it's an area where you've got to be really tight with it, you just let them know that, hey, I can't afford to go double glazing on this because it's going to push me over the edge. So happy to go a bit low E if we need it, and you're really able to let them know from the start. So you've got your thermal assessor, you've got your design company working hand in hand to produce an outcome that is achievable and is workable. So for me, like I said, we're going to be having a guest coming on later this year. We're going to break that down from an actual practitioner's point of view. Obviously, I'm not a thermal assessor. I work with thermal assessors and my team do on a daily basis. We obviously, I've got 20 plus years of experience from a design point of view, spent a lot of time working in that thermal, that green, that efficiency space. So I'm passionate about it. I understand it. I've got a good knowledge of it. But I want to get someone on who has a practical level of how, as a practitioner, they are able to execute that, but also to give tips to people who are passionate about projects and developments to ensure that when you're doing your developments, that you are firstly be able to achieve that 7-star to meet the NCC standard, but secondly, how you can do it in a manner so that your projects are profitable as well, which is what we are very much all about. So look, I hope you enjoyed this episode. As usual, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.